Chapter 3. Audio Fundamentals and Representations. Learning Objectives. In this chapter, the users would learn the following aspects of audio fundamentals and representations: digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth, decibel system, data rate, audio file format, sound synthesis, Midi, wavetable, compression and transmission of audio on internet, adding sound to your multimedia project, audio software and hardware.
What is sound? We live at the bottom of a sea of air. As with the ocean, the farther down one goes, the greater the density of molecules and the greater the pressure it exerts on us. Sound is produced by a rapid vibration in the average density or pressure of air molecules above and below the current atmospheric pressure. We perceive sound as these pressure fluctuations cause our eardrums to vibrate. Sound waves in air are longitudinal waves in that the pulsating motion of the air is in the direction the sound wave travels. Physicists classically demonstrate this with the slinky model, in which a quick push on one end of a slinky will cause a longitudinal wave to travel down its length. Sound is perhaps the most sensuous element of multimedia. It is meaningful speech in any language, from a whisper to a scream. Digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth. Sound can make or break a multimedia session. If a tree falls in a forest and no living creature is there to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer is no. Sound is a perceptual phenomenon only. When a tree falls, a person speaks, or a violin string vibrates, the surrounding air is disturbed, causing changes in air pressure that are called sound waves. When sound waves arrive at our ears, they cause small bones in our ears to vibrate. These vibrations then cause nerve impulses to be sent to the brain, where they are interpreted as sound. A vibrating string on a violin causes disturbances in the surrounding air. These sound waves cause our ears to send nerve impulses to the brain, which interprets the disturbance as sound. Digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth. When something vibrates in the air by moving back and forth, such as the cone of a loudspeaker, it creates waves of pressure. These waves spread like the ripples from a pebble tossed into a still pool, and when they reach your eardrums, you experience the changes of pressure or vibrations as sound. In air, the ripples propagate at about 750 miles per hour, or Mach 1, at sea level. A sound wave, like any other wave, is introduced into a medium by a vibrating object. The vibrating object is the source of the disturbance that moves through the medium. The particles of the medium through which the sound moves is vibrating in a back and forth motion at a given frequency. As a sound wave moves through a medium, each particle of the medium vibrates at the same frequency. Each particle vibrates due to the motion of its nearest neighbor. The first particle of the medium begins vibrating at, say, 500 Hz and begins to set the second particle into vibrational motion at the same frequency of 500 Hz. The second particle begins vibrating at 500 Hz and thus sets the third particle of the medium into vibrational motion at 500 Hz. The process continues throughout the medium. Each particle vibrates at the same frequency. And of course, the frequency at which each particle vibrates is the same as the frequency of the original source of the sound wave. Subsequently, a guitar string vibrating at 500 Hz will set the air particles in the room vibrating at the same frequency of 500 Hz, which carries the sound signal to the ear of a listener, which is detected as a 500 Hz sound wave. Digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth. Sound moves. You should be aware that the air is made up of molecules. Most of the characteristics we expect of air are as a result of the fact that these particular molecules are very light and are in extremely rapid but disorganized motion. This motion spreads the molecules out evenly so that any part of an enclosed space has just as many molecules as any other. If a little extra volume were to be suddenly added to the enclosed space, the molecules nearest the new volume would move into the recently created void and all the others would move a little farther apart to keep the distribution even. Because the motion of the molecules is so disorganized, this filling of the void takes more time than you might think, and the redistribution of the rest of the air molecules in the room takes even longer. Under normal conditions, a wave front moves through air at 1130 feet per second. This is the speed of sound. The back and forth vibrational motion of the particles of the medium would not be the only observable phenomenon occurring at a given frequency. Since a sound wave is a pressure wave, a detector could be used to detect oscillations in pressure from a high pressure to a low pressure and back to a high pressure. As the compressions, high pressure, and rarefactions, low pressure, move through the medium, they would reach the detector at a given frequency. For example, a compression would reach the detector 500 times per second if the frequency of the wave were 500 Hz. Similarly, a rarefaction would reach the detector 500 times per second if the frequency of the wave were 500 Hz. The frequency of a sound wave not only refers to the number of back and forth vibrations of the particles per unit of time, but also refers to the number of compressions or rarefactions that pass a given point per unit of time. Since a sound wave is a pressure wave, a detector could be used to detect oscillations in pressure from a high pressure to a low pressure and back to a high pressure. The sensation of a frequency is commonly referred to as a pitch of a sound. A high-pitched sound corresponds to a high-frequency sound wave, and a low-pitched sound corresponds to a low-frequency sound wave. Digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth. Sound propagation. Sound propagates through the air as longitudinal wave. The speed of sound is determined by the properties of the air and not by the frequency or amplitude of the sound. Sound waves, as well as most other types of waves, can be described in terms of the following basic wave phenomena. Frequency refers to the number of complete sound waves a given sound has per second. Pitch, on the other hand, is a letter name which is associated with sounds of a particular frequency. So pitch and frequency are related in that all musical pitches have some sort of frequency, but not all frequencies are necessarily associated with a single pitch name. One key distinction between these terms is that the pitch is relative, a matter of common agreement among musicians, while frequency is absolute, a precise, unambiguous measurement. Frequency describes a physical phenomenon, while pitch describes a perceptual phenomenon. The perceived pitch of a sound is just the ear's response to frequency. Sound bandwidth is a range of sound frequencies. The human ear can perceive approximately from 20 to 20,000 Hz, but human voice is confined to within 3,000 Hz. The bandwidth refers to the frequency range in which the signal's spectral density is non-zero or above a small threshold value. Importance of bandwidth. Bandwidth enables computation of the power required to transmit a signal. Signals that are band-limited are not time-limited. Sound waves vary in sound pressure level, amplitude, and in frequency or pitch. Acoustics is a branch of physics that studies sound. The word acoustics is derived from the Greek word acoustikos, meaning of or for hearing, ready to hear, and that from acoustos, heard, audible, which in turn derives from the verb akouo, I hear. When a sound wave impinges on a microphone, it makes a membrane vibrate. This membrane flutters in a magnetic field, causing tiny pulses of electricity to be generated. This electrical activity is the analog signal. The analog signals wavers faithfully as per the pressure transients in the air. When the pressure rises, so does the signal. How high or how fast the signal depends on the strength and frequency of the sound. Sound signal is analog in nature. Analog signals can be amplified, transmitted, modulated, stored, retrieved, and reconverted back to sound. However, every step of these processes introduces distortion or errors. An analog signal having amplitude of 1 volt can become 0.9 volts after processing. Hence, accuracy is lost and quality deteriorates. Preservation of quality was the first objective in the digitization of analog signals. The process of digitization is done by sampling the analog signal rapidly as time progresses and converting each sampled value into a number and representing the number in binary form. Thus, a simple analog signal becomes a mass of binary numbers. The mass of numbers can then be accurately converted back to the original analog signal. Digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth. Digitization. Digitization means conversion to a stream of numbers, and preferably these numbers should be integers for efficiency. Figure shows the one-dimensional nature of sound. Amplitude values depend on a 1D variable, time. Digitizing sound is about transforming an analog audio input, like microphone, mixer, or CD cassette record player, into a computer data. This process is of course reversible. Your computer loudspeakers receive an input which has been previously transformed from computer data to analog audio. In digitization, the computer samples the signal very rapidly over time, noting the value, the height basically, of the curve each time, and recording that value as a number. CD quality audio samples the sound signal 44,000 times per second, noting the height of the sound signal once for sample. Playback. Recreate signal from the numbers. Look at each number, plot that height above or below zero line. Repeat for next number. Connect the dots. Draw the signal between the dots. That is the basic idea of digitizing a sound. Unfortunately, things are, practically speaking, not so simple. Questions for producing digital audio, analog to digital conversion. How often do you need to sample the signal? How good is the signal? How is the audio data formatted? Sample rates and bit size. How do we store each sample value? Quantization. How many samples to take? Suppose we are sampling a sine wave. How often do we need to sample it to figure out its frequency? If we sample at 1 time per cycle, we can think it's a constant. If we sample at 1.5 times per cycle, we can think it's a lower frequency sine wave. Now, if we sample at twice the sample frequency, that is, Nyquist rate, we start to make some progress. An alternative way of viewing the waveform regeneration is to think of straight lines joining up the peaks of the samples. In this case, at these sample points, we get a sawtooth wave that begins to start crudely approximating a sine wave. Nyquist rate. For lossless digitization, the sampling rate should be at least twice the maximum frequency responses. Indeed, many times more the better. Digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth. Digitization. Digitization means conversion to a stream of numbers, and preferably these numbers should be integers for efficiency. Figure shows the one-dimensional nature of sound. Amplitude values depend on a 1D variable, time. Digitizing sound is about transforming an analog audio input, like microphone, mixer, or CD cassette record player, into a computer data. This process is of course reversible. Your computer loudspeakers receive an input which has been previously transformed from computer data to analog audio. In digitization, the computer samples the signal very rapidly over time, noting the value, the height basically, of the curve each time, and recording that value as a number. CD quality audio samples the sound signal 44,000 times per second, noting the height of the sound signal once for sample. Playback. Recreate signal from the numbers. Look at each number, plot that height above or below zero line. Repeat for next number. Connect the dots. Draw the signal between the dots. That is the basic idea of digitizing a sound. Unfortunately, things are, practically speaking, not so simple. Questions for producing digital audio, analog to digital conversion. How often do you need to sample the signal? How good is the signal? How is the audio data formatted? Sample rates and bit size. How do we store each sample value? Quantization. How many samples to take? Suppose we are sampling a sine wave. How often do we need to sample it to figure out its frequency? If we sample at 1 time per cycle, we can think it's a constant. If we sample at 1.5 times per cycle, we can think it's a lower frequency sine wave. Now, if we sample at twice the sample frequency, that is Nyquist rate, we start to make some progress. An alternative way of viewing the waveform regeneration is to think of straight lines joining up the peaks of the samples. In this case, at these sample points, we get a sawtooth wave that begins to start crudely approximating a sine wave. Nyquist rate. For lossless digitization, the sampling rate should be at least twice the maximum frequency responses. Indeed, many times more the better. Decibel system. Sound pressure levels, loudness or volume, are measured in decibels, dB. A decibel measurement is actually the ratio between a chosen reference point on a logarithmic scale and the level that is actually experienced. When you quadruple the sound output power, there is only a 6 dB increase. When you make the sound 100 times more intense, the increase in dB is not 100-fold, but only 20 dB. A logarithmic scale, seen below, makes sense because humans perceive sound pressure levels over an extraordinarily broad dynamic range. Why use logarithmic scale? You can look at phenomena over a wide range of scales with numbers that remain conveniently human-sized all the time. An earthquake you can barely detect and one that causes a regional disaster both fit between 1 and 10. Likewise, the stillness of an audio dead room and the pain of an amp turned up to 11 fit between 10 and 130. Fractional measures are converted into differences, which most people find easier to compute quickly. Logarithmic scale is also used because they use divisions that are multipliers 1, 10, 100, 1000 instead of additions 1, 2, 3, 4. Sounds that a human ear is capable of hearing range over a very large range of amplitudes. If you talked about the power delivered to the ear rather than the log of the power delivered to the ear, you would need to use numbers like 100 billion to talk about airplane engines. So rather than deal with that, we use logarithms so that most of the numbers we deal with when talking about sounds vary over reasonable number ranges. The decibel is a logarithmic unit used to express the ratio between the two values of a physical quantity, often power or intensity. One of these quantities is often a reference value, and in this case the decibel can be used to express the absolute level of the physical quantity. The number of decibels is 10 times the logarithm to base 10 of the ratio of the two power quantities. A decibel is 1/10 of a bell, a seldom used unit named in honor of Alexander Graham Bell. The definition of the decibel is based on the measurement practices in telephony of the early 20th century in the Bell system in the United States. The decibel confers a number of advantages, such as the ability to conveniently represent very large or small numbers and the ability to carry out multiplication of ratios by simple addition and subtraction. Audio file format. Bitrate refers to the number of bits or the amount of data that are processed over a certain amount of time. In audio, this usually means kilobits per second. For example, the music you buy on iTunes is 256 kilobits per second, meaning there are 256 kilobits of data stored in every second of a song. The higher the bitrate of a track, the more space it will take up on your computer. Generally, an audio CD will actually take up quite a bit of space, which is why it's become common practice to compress those files down so you can fit more on your hard drive, or iPod, or Dropbox, or whatever. It is here where the argument over lossless and lossy audio comes in. When we say lossless, we mean that we haven't really altered the original file. That is, we have ripped a track from a CD to a hard drive, but haven't compressed it to the point where we have lost any data. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same as the original CD track. More often than not, however, you probably rip your music as lossy. That is, you've taken a CD, ripped it to your hard drive, and compressed the tracks down so they don't take up as much space. The problem is that when you compress a file to save space, you're deleting chunks of data. Just like when you take a PNG screenshot of your computer screen and compress it to a JPEG, your computer is taking the original data and cheating on certain parts of the image, making it mostly the same, but with some loss of clarity and quality. Take these two images as an example. The one on the right has clearly been compressed, and its quality is diminished as a result. MP3, MPEG Audio Layer 3, or MP3 for short, is the most common lossy format around. MP3 is definitely the most well-supported. AAC, Advanced Audio Coding, also known as AAC, is similar to MP3, although it's a bit more efficient. Ogg Vorbis, the Vorbis format, often known as Ogg Vorbis, due to its use of the Ogg container, is a free and open source alternative to MP3 and AAC. WMA, Windows Media Audio, is Microsoft's own proprietary format similar to MP3 or AAC.
Flash Video, FLV. This is not an audio format, but a flash video format. DVF, a Sony proprietary format for compressed voice files, commonly used by Sony dictation recorders. The lossless formats, WAV, AIFF, FLAC, Apple Lossless, and others. WAV and AIFF. Both WAV and AIFF are uncompressed formats, which means they are exact copies of the original source audio. AIFF is made by Apple, so you may see it a bit more often in Apple products, but WAV is pretty much universal. However, since they are uncompressed, they take up a lot of unnecessary space. The free lossless audio codec, Flac, is the most popular lossless format, making it a good choice if you want to store your music in lossless. Unlike WAV and AIFF, it's been compressed, so it takes up a lot less space. However, it's still a lossless format, which means the audio quality is still the same as the original source. So it's much better for listening than WAV and AIFF. It's also free and open source, which is handy if you're into that sort of thing. Apple Lossless, also known as ALAC, Apple Lossless is similar to FLAC. It's a compressed lossless file, although it's made by Apple. Its compression isn't quite as efficient as Flac, so your files may be a bit bigger, but is fully supported by iTunes and iOS, while Flac is not. APE is a very highly compressed lossless file, meaning you will get the most space savings. Its audio quality is the same as Flac, ALAC, and other lossless files, but it isn't compatible with nearly as many players. They also work your processor harder to decode since they are so highly compressed. Generally, I wouldn't recommend using this unless you're very starved for space and have a player that supports it. Sound synthesis. If we take the sequence of numbers, the usual range is 0 to 2, perhaps with a phase increment of 0.1, meaning that we are adding 0.1 for each value, and plug them into the sine formula. What results is another sequence of numbers that describes a sine wave. By carefully selecting the numbers, we can control the frequency of the generated sine wave. There are many different approaches to sound synthesis, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and suitability for creating certain types of sound. 1. Additive synthesis. 2. Mixing sound using additive synthesis principle. 3. Digital oscillators. 4. Subtractive synthesis. 5. Amplitude modulation. 6. Wave shaping. Sound synthesis methods. Additive synthesis refers to a number of related synthesis techniques, all based on the idea that complex tones can be created by the summation or addition of simpler tones. Mixing sound using additive synthesis principle. The technique of mixing simple sounds together to get a more complex sound dates back a very long time. In the Middle Ages, huge pipe organs had a great many stops that could be pulled out to combine and recombine the sounds from several pipes. By using digital oscillators, instead of actual physical devices, a computer can add up any number of simple sounds to create extremely complex waveforms. Only the speed and power of the computer limit the number and complexity of the waveforms. Modern systems can easily generate and mix thousands of sine waves in real time.
This makes additive synthesis a powerful and versatile performance and synthesis tool. Subtractive synthesis. In additive synthesis, we start with simple sounds and add them together to form more complex ones. In subtractive synthesis, we start with a complex sound like noise and subtract or filter out parts of it. Amplitude modulation. Modulated signals are those that are changed regularly in time, usually by other signals. They can get pretty complicated. For example, modulated signals can modulate other signals. To create a modulated signal, we begin with two or more oscillators, or anything that produces a signal, and combine the output signals of the oscillators in such a way as to modulate the amplitude, frequency, and or phase of one of the oscillators. Wave shaping. Wave shaping is a popular synthesis and transformation technique that turns simple sounds into complex sounds. You can take a pure tone, like a sine wave, and transform it into a harmonically rich sound by changing its shape. Acoustic sound generation. Typically, most musical instruments can be considered as consisting of three parts. Excitation source. This gives the system energy, for instance, a violin bow, plectrum, hammer, or player's breath. Waveguide. This is the main part of the instrument that oscillates, for instance, a string of a guitar, or the air column in a flute. Resonator. This primarily takes energy away from the waveguide to produce sound. The resonator is typically the sound box, bell, or body of the instrument. MIDI or Midi. Midi stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. The development of the Midi system has been a major catalyst in the recent unprecedented explosion of music technology. Midi has put powerful computer instrument networks and software in the hands of less technically versed musicians and amateurs, and has provided new and time-saving tools for computer musicians. Midi, short for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, is a technical standard that describes a protocol, digital interface, and connectors, and allows a wide variety of electronic musical instruments, computers, and other related devices to connect and communicate with one another. Midi carries event messages that specify notation, pitch, and velocity, control signals for parameters such as volume, vibrato, audio panning, cues, clock signals that set and synchronize tempo between multiple devices. Instrument control. Midi was invented so that musical instruments could communicate with each other, and that one instrument can control another. When a note is played on a Midi instrument, it generates a digital signal that can be used to trigger a note on another instrument. The capability for remote control allows full-sized instruments to be replaced with smaller sound modules, and allows musicians to combine instruments to achieve a fuller sound or to create combinations such as acoustic, piano, and strings. Midi also enables other instrument parameters to be controlled remotely. An advantage of a structured data such as Midi is the ease with which you can edit the data. Let's say you have a piece of music being played on a honky-tonk piano, but your client decides he wants the sound of a soprano saxophone instead. If you had the music in digitized audio, you would have to re-record and re-digitize the music. When it is in Midi data, however, there is a value that designates the instrument to be used for playing back the music. To change instruments, you just change that value. Instruments that you can synthesize are identified by a general Midi numbering system that ranges from 0 to 127. A Midi file is not a recording of actual music. Rather, it is a spreadsheet-like set of instructions and can use 1,000 times less disk space than the equivalent recorded audio. This made Midi file arrangements an attractive way to share music. The major drawback to this is the wide variation in quality of users' audio cards and in the actual audio contained as samples or synthesized sound in the card that the Midi data only refers to symbolically. Even a sound card that contains high-quality sampled sounds can have inconsistent quality from one instrument to another. Midi itself contains no sound, and the quality of its playback depends entirely on the quality of the sound-producing device and sound recording of samples in the device. Wavetables. There may be a situation or a desire to escape the limitations or complexity of defining an oscillatory waveform using mathematical formulae or line segments. As mentioned before, this could be a concern for processing power, or simply the fact that it would be easier to specify the shape through an intuitive graphical interface. In cases like these, musicians and engineers may use wavetables to be their source oscillator. The wavetable is in a sense an array of n values, with values 1 through to n representing one whole cycle of the oscillator. Each value represents an amplitude at a certain point in the cycle. Wavetables are often displayed graphically, with the option for the user to draw in the wave shape he or she requires, and as such it represents a very powerful tool. Wavetable synthesis is a sound synthesis technique that employs arbitrary periodic waveforms in the production of musical tones or notes. Sound on the Internet. There are several methods for playing digital or MIDI sound from a web page. The sound is actually not part of the web page, but is a separate file with its own address on the Internet, which is embedded in the page. Web browsers associate files with applications and plugins. Figure shows the Preferences panel from Firefox, which lets you specify what to do when the browser downloads a particular file type. The simplest way to embed a sound file in a web page is to call it from an inline HTML anchor. ahref equals mysound.wave. Click here to play my sound. As an HTML anchor, the text "click here to play my sound" will usually be underlined, and when that link is clicked, the browser will find the file mysound.wave, in this case in the same directory as a web page. Will download it, and depending on how the user has instructed the browser to manage WAV files, will open a player and play the sound. Media players are designed to play files as soon as enough of the data is cached in your computer's buffer, a place where data is stored temporarily. Streaming files are dependent upon connection speed. You must wait longer streaming latency before the stream sound begins to play when using a dial-up modem, low bandwidth, than when using a high-speed DSL connection, high bandwidth. Adobe's Flash allows you to integrate the sound tracks that you've made using a sound editor into a web-based multimedia presentation, including both event sounds like button clicks and streaming sounds like background music. There are 7 steps in adding the sound to the multimedia project. They are: determine the file formats that are compatible with your multimedia authoring software and the delivery medium you will be using for file storage and bandwidth capacity. Determine the sound playback capabilities, codecs, and plugins that the end-user system offers. Decide what kind of sound is needed, such as background music, special sound effects, and spoken dialogue. Decide where these audio events will occur in the flow of your project. Fit the sound cues into your storyboard or make up a cue sheet. Decide where and when you want to use either digital audio or MIDI data. Acquire source material by creating it from scratch or purchasing it. Edit the sounds to fit your project. Test the sounds to be sure they are timed properly with the project's images. This may involve repeating steps 1 through 4 until everything is in sync. Audio software. There are many categories of audio software. We list a few here: Windows Device Driver, Device Manager, Recording, Mixer, Audio Editing, Convert Audio, Multitrack Mixing, Record Audio, Voice Changing, Music Transcription, Music Notation, Music Practicing, DJ Software, Audio Stream Recorder, Audio CD Burner. Work of the audio software is described briefly here. Windows Device Driver controls the hardware device. Device Manager, the user interface to the hardware for configuring the devices. You can choose which audio device you want to use. You can set the audio volume. Mixer. Its functions are to combine sound from different sources, to adjust the playback volume of sound sources, to adjust the recording volume of sound sources. Recording, for recording the sound. Audio editing software is used to record, edit, and add effects and more to any audio, music, voice, or sound file. Audio conversion software is used to convert and encode audio files between over 40 different audio file formats. Multi-track mixing software can mix an unlimited number of music, vocal, and audio tracks. Voice changing can be done using the voice changing software. Music transcription software plays music with a visual representation of the notes at slow speeds to assist in transcribing music. Music notation. We can create, save, and print out music compositions with a wide array of notation symbols, time and key signatures with layout tools. Music practicing provides a fun way to practice a musical instrument and to improve your musical ear with visual cues, music playback, performance reports, and more. DJ software makes you the DJ, mix music and other audio recordings live, drag and drop music, preview upcoming tracks, and more. Audio stream recorder. Record just about any audio that plays through your computer. Audio CD burner. Create and record audio CDs or MP3 CDs on Windows or Mac. Express Burn is the fastest CD/DVD writing program in the world. Tone generator generates sine waves, sound frequencies, white noise, audio test tones, sweeps, and other waveforms. Audio CD Ripper extracts digital audio tracks directly from audio CDs to WAV and MP3 audio files on your hard drive. Sound hardware. Multimedia systems can be categorized as multimedia presentation systems, multimedia development systems. Multimedia presentation systems. PC with high-resolution screen, CD-ROM drive, speakers and microphone. Multimedia development systems includes the following: software toolkit for development work, software library for support functions, libraries of clip art, music and video, related hardware. The 6 categories of multimedia devices are analog media devices, digital media devices, general purpose devices, synchronization devices, interaction devices, multimedia platforms. Analog media devices are subcategorized under sources, filters, sinks. Digital media devices are subcategorized under capturing devices, processing devices, presentation devices. General purpose devices. Examples: storage devices like CD-ROM, floppy drive, hard drive, network interface, and general purpose processors. Most devices are digital. Interaction devices. Multimedia application means ability to interact within the application itself. Interaction devices enable user direct control over the multimedia application behavior. Examples: keyboard, mouse, joystick, electronic pen. Synchronization devices. Simultaneous presentation using multiple media, text, audio, video, etc. requires hardware assistance to maintain proper timing. Example: sync generator in audio and video studios, Macromedia Flash, computer games, etc. Multimedia platform. A true multimedia platform integrates and combines various multimedia devices and components. Apple Macintosh popularized the graphical user interface, popularized computer graphics. Native sound file formats, AIFF and MID, native digital video file formats, QuickTime. IBM compatible PC. Original emphasis was on business computing. Recap. Components and measurements of sound. How you use the power of sound can make the difference between an ordinary multimedia presentation and a professionally spectacular one. Misuse of sound, however, can wreck your project. Digital and audio data is the actual representation of sound, stored in the form of thousands of individual samples that represent the amplitude or loudness of sound at a discrete point in time. Midi. Midi data is not digitized sound. It is a shorthand representation of music stored in numeric form. Midi files tend to be significantly smaller than equivalent digitized waveform files. Midi data is device dependent. Its playback depends on the capabilities of the end user system. List the important steps and considerations in recording and editing digital audio. The file size in bytes of a digital recording is sampling rate, duration of recording in seconds, bit resolution by 8, number of tracks, 1 for mono, 2 for stereo. Consumer-grade audio compact discs are recorded in stereo at a sampling rate of 44.1 kHz and a 16-bit resolution. Other sampling rates include 22.05 and 11 kHz at either 16 or 8 bits. When recording digitizing audio, it's important to keep the recording level near the maximum without going over it. Important steps in digital sound editing include removing blank space from the start and end of a recording and normalizing the sound to bring all clips to approximately the same level.
Conclusion. In this chapter, the users have covered the following aspects of audio fundamentals and representations: digitization of sound, frequency and bandwidth, decibel system, data rate, audio file format, sound synthesis, Midi, wavetable, compression and transmission of audio on internet, adding sound to your multimedia project, audio software and hardware.